Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anderzz, and in today's video we're going to be doing something a little bit different than usual. Over the last few weeks I've had it happen a couple times now where I'm having a conversation with someone on stream or just in passing, and some of the language I use leaves them scratching their head a bit. I think Valorant's fairly unique in that we've got people coming from all corners of gaming. You've got people from traditional TAC FPS, you've got people from Fortnite, League of Legends, trading card games, you name it, we've got it. And so there's a little bit of a muddling that the language that's used as a result of that. This video is going to be me demystifying as much of that as humanly possible. 60 terms that I have used for the last 2.5 years across 2 regions competing in world-class Valorant. Let's jump right into it. In order to keep this somewhat didactic and teachable, I've clustered everything into fairly coherent categories. This isn't going to be a situation where I just rapid fire A to Z and melt everyone's brains. I want you to be able to walk away from this video to be able to either use or at least understand these concepts pretty much immediately. That all said, let's not waste time. To get us started, I want to take a look at terminology that's used to categorize agent roles. The reason I want to do this is not only because it's one of the most foundational areas of terminology, but also it's going to be one of the more subjective. This is something where you could ask 10 coaches and 9 of them are going to have different definitions. And so to sort of just lay the groundwork, this is me standardizing them as much as I possibly can. First on our list is going to be anchors. Anchors are an agent role highlighted by 2 major attributes, the first being an ability to stall, and the second being a comfort being a late rotator. Next we have catalysts, who are an agent role that's concerned with opening the door via their namesake catalytic util. Catalytic util is going to be all of your flashes, your stuns, and your entry by proxy or EBP. EBP itself is something that isn't universally understood. It's the utility silo that takes up everything that is a substitute for a traditional gun-on entry. Next we have what I refer to as the 2 spear point roles that are going to be mostly concerned with expanding your team's controlled space. That's going to be both dive and entry. The key differentiator is going to be how they achieve that space expansion. In the case of dive, they'll typically throw themselves into enemy-controlled space and pull their team with them into that space. Entry, by comparison, is more concerned with pushing it forward. Following those 2, we have flexes, which shouldn't be confused with the player role of a flex. A flex agent is going to be one that generally floats between roles, and they derive their value not from being particularly potent in any one category, but being able to shift between them, not only round to round, but in the middle of rounds. Next we have lurks, who are going to be the agents that are best equipped to hold ambiguously held space and look for individual timings. This is going to be one of the more controversial role definitions, without a doubt, but the markers of a lurk are typically their ability to still contribute to a primary game plan while they've been inserted on the other half of the map, as well as having repositioning tools and LOS obstructions that facilitate that search for timings. The last 2 agent types that we have to tackle are going to be the most straightforward by far, the first of which is operators, which, shocking, I know, they like to use the operator. Their hallmarks are going to be untradeability mechanics as well as movement abilities, specifically ones that give them access to verticality that they can convert into higher value with their ops. And then the last one is smokes, whose primary function is to provide vision obstruction. Moving on, the terms I want to tackle next are ones used to discuss ultimates and ultimate economy. The first of those are ones that discuss the power levels of ultimates. In my experience, you can generally categorize ultimates into one of 3 buckets, the first of which being conditional ultimates. These are going to be a power level that's characterized by conditionality in use, impact, or both. A step up from conditional ultimates, we have impact ultimates, which have no conditionality to their use and offer a minimal but nearly guaranteed impact, usually with significantly greater upside being a possibility. Then, at the top of the totem pole, we have power ultimates, which are going to have no conditionality to their use like impact ultimates, but instead of offering only a small guaranteed impact, what they guarantee is round warping in capacity. Shifting away from power levels, the terminology that I want to look at next discusses the economic functions of ultimates within a grander composition. First, we have farm or funnel ultimates. This is going to be an ultimate priority that represents the core of a composition's ult economy. Farm ultis are generally power ultimates or impact ultimates, and they have the highest round conversions available to teams in most scenarios. Next, we have Snowball Ultimates, which represent the second component in a standard ult economy cycle. Snowball ultis are a bit of a misnomer in that you don't snowball into them. They're called Snowball Ultimates because they create the snowball that accelerates the remainder of your ult cycle. They do so by consistently ensuring kills, plants, or orb control, and in order to reach that end are usually impact ultimates. Next, we have Cascade Ultimates, which are the third component in a standard ult econ cycle, and they generally aim to quote-unquote close the loop of a primary cycle. They create a situation that, as consistently as can be possibly achieved, will ensure that the farm ultimate that is the crux of our ult econ becomes available. In order to reach that level of consistency, though, Cascade Ultimates are almost always power ultimates. Taking a step away from the main ult econ cycle, we have two that will fall outside of those primary loops. The first of these is going to be buffer or bridge ultimates, and as their name implies, they're meant to create a buffer if something goes wrong with the main cycle. If you fall behind by a pip or two, these ultimates, usually conditional impact, will try to drag forward the composition and get it back on track. The second category, luxury ultimates, are also, as their name implies, pure luxuries. Their high conditionality or extremely minimal impact means that planning them into your grander ult econ strategy usually represents more risk than reward. Now that we've looked at ultimates both from a power level and economic role perspective, we now get to look at the typical recurring cycles that they fall into. The first of these is a standard ult economy cycle, which is going to be composed of a farm ultimate, a snowball ultimate, and a cascade ultimate in a primary loop that are then supplemented by 1 to 2 bridge or luxury ultimates. Alternatively, we have a binary ultimate cycle, which unsurprisingly has a binary nature, with a farm ultimate and a cascade ultimate forming a 2-point primary loop, and 1 to 3 bridge or luxury ultimates. Lastly, we have paired ultimate cycles, which are going to be composed of 2 sets of combined ultimates with 1 bridge or luxury ultimate outside of that primary loop. Before moving on, there's one more term pertaining to ultimates I want to touch on, and that's fence ultimates. This is going to be more relevant when actually playing the game as opposed to theorizing around it, because these are going to be the ultimates that in pre-round analysis aren't currently available, but are likely to become available in the middle of the round. They're quote-unquote on the fence in terms of their availability. If your opponent is 1 pip, 2 pips away, and you expect them to get a kill or an orb, that is a fence ultimate. Next up, we have what is, in my opinion, probably the single most important category for describing macro level of theory in Valorant, but it's one that's also not particularly prolific. It's borrowed almost completely from the TCG world, and it covers style dynamics. Before getting into the meat of style dynamics, there are 2 terms that stage set quite well for it. The first of these is going to be the framework of answering or asking questions. This is a classic phrase from TCGs used to describe who currently holds tempo. You say one person is asking the questions at any given time, and the opponent has to answer those questions. Similarly, you can look at a game of Valorant and say, okay, that team is the one asking the questions right now. Following a similar train of thought, we have the classic reference of referring to one party in a game as the beatdown. An important distinction, though, between this and asking or answering questions is that when you say someone's the beatdown, it will generally more indicate a matchup-wide role rather than a current level of tempo in the game. Used in examples, I just got the first kill in a round. Because of the way that this round's tempo is hashing out, I'm in a 5 versus 4, I now get to ask the questions. Alternatively, I'm playing an extremely aggro, proactive composition into one that's a lot more passive and entrenchment focused. In this matchup, I as the aggressor am the beatdown. Now, we can look at triangular or style dynamics itself. Triangular dynamics is a concept for game balance and competitive design that enforces that balance through the creation of a triangle of countering relationships. It's been applied most prominently in TCGs like Magic the Gathering, but it's also been applied in MMOs, tabletop war games, RTSs, and countless other competitive gaming mediums. In Valorant, triangular dynamics can be applied using stylistic archetypes as the corners of the triangle. It also uses the most standard siloing for triangular dynamics, which is aggro beating control, control beating midrange, and midrange beating aggro. Now is probably as good a time as any to say that this concept goes far deeper than I'm going to be able to explain in 5 sentences, and I have a full Mastering Macro series that covers a majority of the concepts in this video in far deeper detail. I'll link them all in the description below, so if you want to dive into this to that deeper level, feel free to check it out. Clarifying to the level that we need to for style dynamics, though, there are a number of things that we need to touch on. Most obviously, we have to define the corners of the triangle. The first of those three styles will be Aggro, which is the tempo-focused style. It takes tempo early, sets an overwhelming pace to maintain that tempo, and when necessary, leans on reach as its primary win condition. Aggro counters control and is countered by mid-range. To clarify what reach is, it's tools and tactics that are used to get down the final stretch in a specific win conversion scenario. Because of Aggro's nature, this is also usually done under duress. You're likely on the verge of losing tempo or flipping around, and you are using reach as your insulation against that failure. In Valorant, reach can take a number of different forms. It can be offsite post-plant, where we were super aggressive, we took tempo, we got our spike down, then we play offsite, and they flood retake. Us using an offsite molly that stalls for 7 seconds before that spike goes off is the sort of reach that will allow us to convert that round. Similarly, if we have a late reflank of the site to ensure that our post-plant gets through to the end of that timer, that is another example of reach. Moving on to mid-range, it's the stylistic archetype focused on flexibility. It looks to beat its opponents through high efficiency, the flexibility of use of its resources, or through raw attrition and util volume. Mid-range counters aggro and is countered by control. And while it's fairly common language, I do want to quickly explain what attrition is. It's a term from traditional military theory that involves an approach to warfare where both sides are worn down over time by trading resources. At its core, it's a brute force approach that relies on resource superiority or a greater efficiency in the trading of those resources. Finally, we have control, which is generally seen as the most complex of these three style archetypes, focused on permission. It creates static systems of denial to prevent opponent progress, and after conditioning those opponents to spend excessive resources to overcome that denial, it varies where it gives the opponents permission to progress. With giving that permission, though, control will situate in such a way that that progress that the opponents are making can be dealt with favorably later on if required. Throughout this process of denial, control is constantly looking to reach a state referred to as stabilization. Control counters mid-range and is countered by aggro. To clarify, stabilizing is the process of one team denying their opponent so much that they reach a point of resource superiority and relative safety. I say resource superiority here out of habit talking through military theory, but something that's important to distinguish relative to Valorant is that successful attrition implemented by mid-range does not reach the same state of stabilization that control does. Stabilized control will generally be up in headcount resources, not just utility. The last term I want to tackle here is less relevant to how control is played, and more so how you beat it. That term being going under. Going under is a term generally used to describe circumventing the denial setups that control presents. You generally quickly or powerfully force your way through, quote-unquote, going under the control setup. Next up, we'll discuss terms for conducting map analysis. The first 4 of these will be terms for discussing space types, beginning with owned space. Owned space will generally denote areas of a map that are under the control of a specific team at the start of a round, or during the steady state of the map that shortly follows barriers dropping. Following that, we have intermediate space, which will be the areas of a map where a team can reasonably expect noteworthy resistance from opponents. Exec space will denote the areas of a map from which a team can launch a site execute, which I'm sure we're all stunned by. Finally, we have transitional space, which will be the parts of a map whose primary function is to facilitate rotations. A really important point of clarification here is that transitional spaces will never be the only means of rotation between 2 important areas, like a spawn and a site. The last term for map analysis I want to touch on is one that I use incredibly frequently, and that's angle density, or AD with a number attached. This will describe the number of angles that a player is exposed to in a given position. An example of this in action is going to be if I'm an attacker peeking a site and I'm exposed to 4 potential defensive positions, I am swinging into AD4. Shown literally, when swinging A short on Haven, I peek out into AD3, technically AD4 if you want to consider the top of the far boxes. For this next section, I want to do something a little bit different in that we're not going to look at strictly one definition at a time. Instead, I'm going to show pairs of commonly conflated or combined terms. Terms that people mistake one for the other, or terms that people use one term for that really need to be distinguished. The first of these pairs will be clarifying between flood and set retakes. We all know about the strategy of playing for retake, but without this level of clarification, massive mistakes can be made. Flood retakes, as their name would imply, involves the flooding of reinforcements into the site, emphasizing an immediacy of support rather than a comprehensiveness of that support. Set retakes, by comparison, will involve reinforcements pausing before entering and staging a full-blown re-exec of the site. For the next pair, we have soft holds versus hard holds. These are going to be defensive holds, a soft one being one that you will do until it becomes unsafe, a hard hold being one that you will do until you are dead. For the next pair, we have Antiflash versus Counterflash. Antiflash is the act of playing around an opposing flash by preemptively turning away from it or tucking so that you aren't flashed in the first place. Counterflash is responding to an opposing flash with a flash of your own. Next, we have counterattack versus counteraggro. As someone who heavily leans on style dynamics, this is one that requires very, very acute distinction. A counterattack, counteroffensive, or counteraggression is a classical military term for an attack that is made in response or reaction. A counteraggro is not shorthand for counteraggression. Counteraggro is quite literally counteraggro, as in the stylistic archetype aggro. This means that a counter-aggro is a play, tactic, or maneuver made to counter the aggro playstyle. That usually manifests as a proactive, not reactive or responsive, defender-initiated play to seize tempo before attackers can. You are countering the aggro nature of something versus counter-attacking in reaction to something. For the last pair, I have half buys versus broken buys. I'm not a TAC FPS person, so there may be pre-existing definitions of these that don't jive with what I've put out here, but the way I distinguish between a half buy and a broken buy is that a half buy is when an economically strapped team buys middling resources intending to full buy in the following round. A broken buy, by comparison, is when half of a team, 2 or 3 members, are full buying, and the remainder savor half buy. In one case, you're expecting 5 stingers, 5 marshals, some blend in between. In the other, you're expecting a couple rifles. Now we have a couple general concepts we want to tackle, the first of which is going to be priority. Priority is a system in TCGs that denotes which player is able to play cards at any given time. For example, if player 1 has priority, they have the option to hold that priority and play more cards, or pass it to their opponent. In Valorant, the way that we can use priority is when looking at map control. The language of holding or passing priority can be used to clarify which team has control of important space at any given time, especially in cases where that space is going to switch hands multiple times inside of a single round. Next, we have sunk costs, which is a concept stolen from my past in finance and business to describe irrecoverable investments. In Valorant, the term will be used in a couple different places, most commonly to describe utility burnt on default or in fakes, or to describe defending positions that are one and done and will likely result in the defender dying. Their position is a sunk cost position. For the last of these general terms, I want to talk about build order loss, which is a concept stolen from RTSs. In RTSs, like StarCraft, Age of Empires, etc., the order in which you build your base and units can frequently commit you to a very specific game plan. When you're playing without perfect information, which is the case in most RTSs, this sort of committal effect can result in near unavoidable losses where one player simply built something that naturally countered the opponent's build. This can in theory be countered by getting sufficient information and scouting early on, but the overarching concept is still an important thing to have a phrase for. In Valorant, similar situations can occur when you have high committal pre-round calls. For example, we're an attacking team that pre-round calls a full A hit, the defending team gambles a full 4-stack on A, and pending our information gathering and mid-rounding, if we hit that A site, we have had a build order loss. We hit into their stack, get denied, or die. For the last section, we're going to tackle something I get honestly the most questions about, which is my use of military theory and classical warfare concepts in my Valorant strategy. So let's jump right into those. First, we're going to tackle all of the simple ones, starting with entrenchment, which is a defensive strategy involving the fortification of a deployment, creating a quote-unquote no man's land kill zone in the area preceding that fortification. Next, we'll have force multipliers, which, as their name describes quite succinctly, is utility weaponry or terrain that multiplies the relative efficacy of a force. Analoging this over to Valorant would be specialized utility or bottlenecks that allows a single anchor to hold against multiple opponents. Next, we have interdiction, which is the act of disrupting or attacking supply lines. In Valorant tactics, interdiction is going to be best analog to the disruption of rotational corridors or gameplay elements that disable utility. And then we have one of our first tactical maneuvers, which is going to be rolling retreats. A rolling or fighting retreat is a defensive adaptation of classic hit-and-run tactics where a force will apply waves of resistance against the advance that they are retreating against. This is generally going to be done with the intent of slowing the opponent's advance while doing small damage at low risk rather than attempting to stop them outright. An exaggerated visualization of this would be to look at this blocked corridor where a defender retreats back, turning repeatedly. Their overall retreat line is still the same, but the waves of resistance that they apply create a staggered effect. If we visualize that removed from the terrain, you can see why it's referred to as a rolling retreat. The pattern is very cyclical and wave-like. Moving on to our next grouping of military concepts, we're going to look at envelopments. Categorically, envelopments are an indirect approach to warfare that covers flank maneuvers. A single envelopment is quite simple. You have two forces in conflict, and they envelop on a single side, creating a flank. A double envelopment is largely predictable, where instead of having a single flank, you have two simultaneously with a holding force in the center. Lastly, we have encirclements, which are a little bit more abstract. They can involve single envelopments, they can involve double envelopments, but the net effect is that all sides of the opposing force are either enveloped or against an impassable object. You have fully encircled your opponent. The next concept I want to cover is defense in depth, which is the defensive strategy of creating consecutive layers of defense, each aiming to impede but not outright stop an opponent. Rather than relying on a single, potent front line, defense in depth relies on the cumulative impact of those multiple but independently weaker layers. Expanding on a subtype of defense in depth, we're going to touch on elastic defense. Elastic defense uses the same general concept as DID, where it's using multiple consecutive layers of defense to create a cumulative effect that stops an advance. The key differentiator being that in defense in depth, attackers will be allowed to break through consecutive layers eventually expected to run out of gas. Elastic defense, by comparison, will give ground when necessary, but under the presumption that if pressure subsides, it will snap back to its original shape, taking back ground. Another interesting tactical note here is that as elastic defense retreats, it will often look for double envelopments. The natural concavity that is created as the elastic defense falls back creates natural envelopment. And now we have just only one more concept grouping to cover, and that is going to be maneuver warfare and all of its components. Maneuver warfare is one of the most highly contributed to concepts in high-order military strategy throughout mankind's history. That said, it's been most concisely distilled by the Israeli military historian and theorist Martin van Creveld. In his synopsis, maneuver warfare has 6 primary components: combined arms, decentralized command, flexibility, Schwerpunkt, surprise, and tempo. Expanding on each of these in turn, we first have combined arms, which is simply the concept of applying a diversified and complementary suite of assets to achieve a desired outcome. Traditionally, in warfare, this involves the coordination of any multiple of infantry, armor, air support, artillery, and/or naval forces. In Valorant, a really simple example of combined arms would be the coordination of an Astra Suck with a raised nade. Next, we have decentralized command, which is the concept of creating a system of explicitly understood objectives, contingency protocols, but most importantly, overarching intent. The system that results allows all levels of a force to make rapid, independent decisions and still consistently converge on a unified objective. Next, we have flexibility, which, while it's just a normal word, as it pertains to maneuver warfare, it is concerned with the diversification of a force's available resources and skills, as well as the extent to which there are redundancies for those resources and skills. The overarching end goal being that it's trying to create a force that, even if segmented and torn apart in some ways, will still be able to operate and capitalize on any opportunity. Next, we have Schwerpunkt, which is a German concept from the 19th century, but most prominently came to use during the 1900s in World War II, which quite literally translates to the center of gravity and is a concept for objective setting. It aims to designate the focal point or source of power in an engagement. Moving on, we have Surprise, which, as it pertains to maneuver warfare, is really better labeled as unpredictability. Its inclusion encompasses the preference for quickly executed unsignal operations that disallow any sort of counterattack or reaction. And finally, we have the OODA loop. You'll notice OODA loop is not tempo, but the tempo element in maneuver warfare is best captured in this. The OODA loop is a decision-making concept developed by American military theorist John Boyd. In its simplest forms, an OODA loop just has 4 steps to observe, orient, decide, and act. When discussing OODA loops and maneuver warfare on a broader basis, it is generally described that whoever has tempo is the one who can either OODA loop faster or get inside and disrupt the OODA loop of their opponent. Well, that's all she wrote. This has been 60 terms that I've used while coaching professional Valorant for the last 2.5 years. One of the goals in creating this was just to demystify as much as I possibly could. Some people will look at me when I use these terms and say, that's gibberish and doesn't actually mean anything, you're just saying it to look smart. I promise you, it's all part of a grander system where the one goal is for us to be able to discuss more and more complex theories without having to rehash paragraphs of language every single time we want to reference a single concept. That said, if you got value out of this, hopefully it's giving you some basis for common language to discuss the game. And if you did enjoy it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Before we go, a quick shout out to my YouTube members, Colin Torbis, Hick Messiah, and Golden Fury. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.